Mother's Haunting Return. A scary story from Reddit. Subscribe to Scary Stories Vault for great videos to relax, study, or just enjoy. It was a rainy Tuesday evening when my father first told me that he had seen my mother. Now, that sentence might not sound strange to someone unfamiliar with our family, but my mother had been dead for nearly 5 years. She had passed away after a long battle with dementia, and her final days had been a heartbreaking blur of confusion and fear for all of us. I wasn't sure what to make of his statement at first. I chalked it up to the old man's grief, manifesting in odd ways as he aged. Grief can do that. Create illusions, especially when you're alone in a big house with nothing but memories. But the look in his eyes unsettled me. It wasn't just the grief. It was something darker, something desperate. He said he saw her standing by the window in their bedroom, looking out at the garden like she always did when she was alive. His voice wavered, and I could see him struggling to keep it together. "I must be losing it," he muttered, staring into his cup of tea, shaking his head as if trying to rid himself of the memory. I assured him that it was normal. "Sometimes the brain plays tricks," I said. "After losing someone, it's not uncommon to see them, you know, in your mind's eye." But something about the way he described it was too vivid, too real. It gnawed at me, that small voice in the back of my head telling me there was more to it. A week passed without incident, and I began to forget about the whole thing, until it happened again. I had dropped by the house to check in on my dad, as I often did. He was sitting in his favorite armchair, staring blankly at the TV, when I walked in. He barely acknowledged me, which was strange. Normally, he'd grumble about the uselessness of modern television or ask if I'd heard from my sister recently. Instead, he just sat there, his face pale and drawn. "What's up, Dad?" I asked, plopping myself down on the couch. He didn't answer right away. His eyes flickered toward the hallway that led to the bedrooms. "She's back," he said quietly, so softly I almost didn't hear him. A cold shiver ran down my spine. "Who's back?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "Your mother," he said, still not taking his eyes off the hallway. "I saw her again last night." This time, his voice was steady, but his hands were trembling. He wasn't crying or breaking down like before. This was different. He was scared, and that frightened me more than anything. "Did you check?" I asked, immediately regretting the question. The logical part of me, the part that wanted to comfort my father, was at war with the part that had begun to believe something else was happening here. "No," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't. I was too scared." I had never seen my father scared of anything in my life. The man was a rock, but now, sitting in front of me, he looked small, fragile. "We should call someone," I suggested. "Maybe the police." "No," he snapped, his voice suddenly sharp. "No police. They'll think I'm crazy. They'll think I've lost my mind. Then, maybe a doctor." "No doctors either," he insisted, his eyes wide and wild now. "I'm not crazy. I know what I saw." I backed off. Arguing with him was pointless. He had always been stubborn, and I knew when not to push. Later that night, I couldn't get his words out of my head. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying our conversation over and over. There was something wrong with the house, with him. I could feel it. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that this wasn't just about grief. Something was happening to my father, something I didn't understand. A few days passed, and the next time I visited, I brought up the idea of staying over. He brushed it off at first, but I insisted. He looked tired, too tired to argue. So that night, I slept in my old bedroom. The one I hadn't set foot in since I moved out years ago. The house was quiet, eerily quiet. I had forgotten just how unsettling the old place could be at night. Every creak, every groan of the floorboards seemed amplified, As I lay there, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, I wondered if maybe my dad wasn't imagining things. At around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of footsteps. Light, soft footsteps, like someone was walking around upstairs. My heart pounded in my chest as I sat up, straining to hear. The house was dark, but I could make out a faint light coming from under the door of my father's bedroom. I got out of bed and crept down the hallway, my bare feet making no sound on the cold wooden floor. The closer I got to his room, the louder the footsteps became, but they weren't coming from inside. They were coming from the hall, right where I was standing. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I couldn't see anyone, but I could hear it. The unmistakable sound of someone walking past me, as if they were just inches away. I turned, my eyes scanning the darkness, but there was nothing there. A gust of cold air blew past me, and in that moment I smelled it, my mother's perfume. The same lavender scent she had worn for as long as I could remember. I stumbled back, my heart racing. This wasn't grief. This wasn't a figment of my father's imagination. Something was in the house. The next morning, I didn't say anything to my father. I didn't tell him what I had heard, what I had smelled. I wasn't ready to admit it, not yet, but I could see it in his eyes. He knew. A few nights later, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I was sleeping in my room when I heard it. A faint whisper, just outside the door. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like a woman's voice, my mother's voice. I shot up in bed, my pulse racing. The whispering continued, growing louder, more insistent. It was coming from the hallway. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept under the bed, an old habit from when I used to live in the city, and slowly opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the whispering hadn't stopped. It was louder now, echoing off the walls. I stepped out, bat in hand, and followed the sound down the hall. It led me to my parents' bedroom. I hesitated outside the door, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I didn't want to go in. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to run, to get out of the house and never come back, but I couldn't. My father was in there, and I had to know. I pushed the door open. The room was dark, but I could see my father lying in bed, his back to me. The whispering had stopped. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But then, I saw her. She was standing by the window, just like my father had said. My mother, or something that looked like her. She was facing away from me, her long gray hair cascading down her back, her thin, frail body outlined in the pale moonlight. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. It was her, but it wasn't her. She was different, wrong. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, like a marionette being held up by invisible strings. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely audible. She didn't move, didn't even acknowledge that I was there. I took a step closer, my heart pounding in my ears. "Mom?" I said again, louder this time. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, she turned to face me. Her eyes were empty, hollow. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, the corners stretching too far, like her skin was being pulled from the inside. She stared at me, unblinking, her head tilting slightly to one side. I stumbled back, the bat slipping from my hand and clattering to the floor. That was when my father woke up. "What? What are you doing?" he asked, his voice groggy with sleep. He hadn't seen her. He hadn't seen the thing standing by the window. I blinked, and she was gone. The next few days were a blur. I didn't tell my father what I had seen. How could I? He was already on edge, and I didn't want to push him further. But I knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. The final straw came a week later. It was late at night, and I was in my room, packing up some of my things to leave. I had made up my mind. I was going to convince my father to sell the house, to move somewhere else, anywhere else. This place wasn't safe. As I was packing, I heard it again, the whispering. But this time, it wasn't coming from the hallway. It was coming from inside my room. I spun around, my heart in my throat. The room was empty, but the whispering continued, growing louder, more frantic. I backed up towards the door, my hands shaking as I reached for the knob. And then I saw it. The closet door. It was slowly opening, inch by inch, as if someone, or something, was on the other side. I bolted. I didn't care what was in there. I just ran. Down the hallway, past my father's room, out the front door. I didn't stop until I was outside, gasping for air, my hands shaking uncontrollably. I never went back. I convinced my father to leave the house, to sell it. He never questioned why. Maybe he knew, deep down, that something was wrong. We never spoke about it again. The house was sold a few months later to a young couple who seemed thrilled with the charming old place. I wonder if they've seen her yet. I wonder if they will.